It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Malka Simkovich to the latest edition of Two Scholars and a Talmud. Dr. Simkovich is the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and the Director of the Catholic Jewish Studies program at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. Her first book, The Making of Jewish Universalism, From Exile to Alexandria, was published in 2016. And her second book, Discovering Second Temple Literature, the Scriptures and Stories That Shaped Early Judaism, was published in 2018. It received the 2019 AJL Judaica Reference Honor Award. Her new book, which we're going to discuss today, Letters from Home, The Creation of Diaspora in Jewish Antiquity, will be published in June 2024. And we'll provide a link below this video so that our audience can pre-order the book online. Dr. Simkovich's articles have been published in journals such as the Harvard Theological Review and the Journal for the Study of Judaism, as well as on mainstream forums such as the Jewish Review of Books and the Christian Century. In addition to a role at Catholic Theological Union, Simkovich is a Leon Charney Fellow at the Yeshiva Center for Israel Studies and a Kogod Research Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. She speaks widely to audiences across North America and beyond on topics of the Hebrew Bible, Jewish history, and contemporary Jewish-Christian relations. Dr. Simkovich, thank you for joining Talmud for Everyone today. It's customary to begin this show by asking guests about their academic journey, how they got interested in what they're doing. Could you share a few words about how you embarked on a journey into the academic study of Judaism?
This is a great question. First of all, I want to thank you for having me. It's so wonderful to be speaking with you today. I appreciate your taking the time. And I won't bore you with too long of an autobiography, but I will say that I had no idea that the Second Temple period was even an era in Jewish history until I was well into college, embarrassingly enough. I mean, I had heard the phrase, but the notion that there was anything to really explore in terms of Jewish history and literature between 515 BCE, when the Second Temple is complete, and 70 CE, it really was not on my radar. I was brought up Orthodox and I had a standard yeshiva day school education. So my mental timeline went from the end of the Hebrew Bible straight into the world of the rabbis perfectly seamlessly. And that turned Ezra into a rabbi, and all the figures at the end of the Hebrew Bible, they're all kind of proto-rabbis, right? Because nothing really important happened between whenever it was that they lived and the rabbinic community of the first century. I first really started thinking about Second Temple Judaism as a discipline when I began a master's program at Harvard, and that master's program was actually not in Second Temple Judaism, it was in Hebrew Bible. So when I got there, I thought that I was going to pursue an academic career in Hebrew Bible. And I'll just say, I don't know if I should share this publicly because it's a little negative. I did have many good experiences at Harvard, and I did make friends, and there were a lot of good things about it. But I did feel some significant pressure to read scriptural traditions through a variety of modern lenses. And whether this was self-imposed or whether this was real external pressure, I can't say. All of our memories are always subjective, but the way I remember it is feeling pressure to read an ancient text and then say, okay, now I'm going to examine this through a post-colonial lens, or now I'm going to examine this through a feminist lens, or whatever it was. And it occurred to me at some point in this, it was only a 2-year program, but it occurred to me that the field was so saturated that it was almost like you couldn't contribute without some kind of contemporary lens. That's how I felt. Is it true? It's probably not true. But I remember as a 22-year-old thinking, oh my God, the only way I'm going to be able to say anything new is if I find some contemporary lens and then I find some interesting ancient texts and then I put them together into some kind of sandwich. And I just remember feeling like this isn't stirring passion. So this was kind of brewing in me. And then I happened to come across some ancient texts that were written by Greek-speaking Jews living in Egypt in the first century One of these texts is the Testament of Abraham, which is preserved in a collection called the Pseudepigrapha. And the Pseudepigrapha is not really a collection at all. It's just a modern 18th century word that we use to denote a massive amount of ancient Jewish texts written anywhere from between 4th century BC and maybe 4th century CE or beyond. But in any case, I came across this astounding novella or some kind of story that it was impossible to categorize this text, the Testament of Abraham. And I was reading a commentary on it. And in the commentary, it said this text might reflect the universalist movements of Jews who were living in Egypt in the late Second Temple period that were so popular at the time. And I was like, what in the world? So this kind of like brought me into a deep dive of this very vibrant, very diverse world or worlds of Jewish life in the late Second Temple period that I had never encountered. It was totally happenstance. But when I started to read and read and read all this literature that had been produced by pious, very very what we would call observant Jews in the ancient world, and I encountered its playfulness and its creativity. I was smitten. I was totally overwhelmed with this massive, expansive corpus of literature that no one had ever told me I should be looking at. And then once I did, I thought, okay, I'm in my home now. This is where I can do interesting things and explore and maybe even make a contribution. Whereas when I was studying Deuteronomy, I felt like, oh, I'm just, I don't know enough philology and I don't know enough Ugaritic and I don't know enough of these ancient languages. And I didn't feel like I was going to have this future of really contributing in a significant way. And then I got to this later material and it just felt like there was so much room to have new conversations.
That's really interesting. There's a lot I can relate to there. I'm a former student, as you know, of Gabriele Boccaccini, who's done a lot to try to promote the study of Second Temple Judaism. And I'm glad you brought up the periodization because for our audience, a lot of people might not know Second Temple period. What is that? So this is a scholarly category, let's say, that tries to classify time, history, from when the Second Temple of Jews was built, circa 515 BCE, extending all the way to its destruction in 70 CE by the Romans, although some extended even to 132 to 136 of the Bar Kokhba revolt, since there was still a real attempt, a real hope amongst Jews to rebuild the temple. And during this periodization, it's not like it's the dark ages of Judaism. There's a plethora of literature of writings that many people don't know about that aren't contained in the canon, the Jewish canon, whether we're talking about the Tanakh and then the Rabbinic corpus, the Talmud, etc., or if we're thinking of Christianity, Old Testament and New Testament canons. And I can definitely relate to that since I worked a lot on the New Testament. It's very hard to say something new on canonical literature. But lo and behold, you have all this non-canonical writings where there are plenty of interesting things to look at, written by Jews that can enrich our understanding about early Judaism. So thanks for sharing that. And in fact, let's move to your book, your forthcoming book, Letters from Home, which assesses how Second Temple Jews living in Judea or the land of Israel and in the diaspora define their identities vis-a-vis one another, against one another, how they view Jewish life, both in the land of Israel and in the diaspora. Perhaps we can start our discussion by looking at the meaning of the term diaspora itself. In your book, you claim that the word diaspora originated in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible called the Septuagint. What does this term diaspora mean? And how does the Septuagint conceive of Jewish life in the diaspora?
This is a massive question. It's a great question. Before we go into it, I want to go back to your definition of the Second Temple era and the whole question of periodization very briefly, because I'm always talking to my students about the Second Temple era, the Second Temple period. And the more I use this phrase, the more embarrassed I am about it. Maybe embarrassed is not the right word, but it's a confusing term because it suggests that you have this massive time period that is sort of perfectly synchronous with um, with a particular place. So in other words, when we say Second Temple, we're imagining that Jewish life coalesced very evenly and cohesively around a particular place from 515 BC until 70 or 135 or well into the second century. Um, I, I I wrote this book to challenge that. I don't know if Second Temple era is even the right phrase because for most of this period, the vast majority of Jews are not living in proximity to the temple. But then, of course, you don't want to take it too far. Even those Jews who are living outside the land of Israel, many of them are deeply connected to the land, to Jerusalem, to the temple. We have a lot of evidence that they're supporting the temple financially, they're making pilgrimages, but it's this very tightrope. It's this very question of loyalty and to what extent do we belong to our host country? To what extent do we belong to our ancestral land? This is the question for Jews in the ancient world. And sometimes when we say Second Temple era, we can too easily eclipse those questions by just presuming, well, for every Jew living at this time, this was the world of the temple. I don't know that it was. So I want to problematize it a little bit while also recognizing that Jews all over the world, all over the Roman world, were aware of the temple, and then in varying degrees were expressing their connections to it in different ways. So that's just a response to that phrase, which I still use because there's no other compelling replacement for it yet. So as for the question of diaspora, this is a really key question. Diaspora comes from the Greek word diaspora. It's actually a prefix. Dia means to go over or through, towards. There's a kind of directional element to dia, and when you combine this with spora, which is a verb that is used in Greek that denotes the sowing of seeds, you get an image of dispersion, right? A scattering of seeds upon foreign lands. And diaspora as a noun does not appear until the late 3rd century BCE, when we find it in one of the major translations of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and that's the Septuagint. Not the only translation of the Torah into Greek that was circulating at this time, but what becomes the authoritative translation, the one that Jews are even reading in their synagogues. Septuagint first uses the term in a translation of Deuteronomy 28, which is probably the most depressing passage in all of the Pentateuch. Deuteronomy 28 is a list of horrible curses that will come upon the Israelites if they abandon the terms of the covenant between Israel and God. And I'm going to say more about that, but I just want to say a little bit more about diaspora in general. It only appears very, very rarely in Second Temple Jewish literature, 12 times in books that end up being included into the collection of the Septuagint. And I'm very careful about the way I say that because books like Jeremiah were produced much later. They were translated into Greek much later than the first 5 books. So now there's a version of Jeremiah in Greek that's preserved in the Septuagint, but the books of the Septuagint were not written by the same people at the same time. So I know it sounds like a little bit of a snobby distinction, but if I were to say to you, diaspora appears just 12 times in the Septuagint, well, not you, but listeners might think, okay, that means the same writer is using the word diaspora 12 times. It's not true. It's actually different individuals over the course of centuries using this word. But if you keep in mind that there are thousands and thousands of pages of literature that's being produced, I mean, we have so much Jewish literature from this era in Greek, and that's what survives. So there's hundreds of thousands of pages of Greek texts being produced by Jews in the 3rd and 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, and we only have 12 references to diaspora that ends up in the Septuagint, and then 3 other references in all of Second Temple literature. So it's a rare, rare word. One of the reasons why I think it is a rare word is because it seems to have been invented to denote God's rejection of those Israelites who live outside the land. And I think that Jews, by the end of the Second Temple period, are aware that this is not a neutral designation for Jews or Israelites who live outside the land. It is an argument that it is an argument that Israelites and their Jewish descendants are embodiments of divine rejection. So now I want to say a little bit about where we first find the word to make my point. In Deuteronomy 28, we open this very dark and disturbing passage with the prediction that when or if the Israelites abandon the terms of the covenant, they'll be expelled from the land and they'll be a source of horror to the foreign nations. Later in this passage, we have a more explicit image of how this expulsion will take place. But the writers of the Septuagint move this image of expulsion into the very beginning of this pericope of this passage by translating the Hebrew word for horror, za'ava, as diaspora, dispersion. And the translation that we find in the Septuagint of the Hebrew version tightens the association between expulsion and shame, right? If you're going to translate horror as diaspora, you're arguing that the experience of living outside the land of Israel is a source of shame, because then all the other nations see these expelled Israelites and they say, why are you here? Oh, it's because your God hates you. It's because your God has rejected you. It's because your God doesn't want a relationship with you anymore. So this association between expulsion and shame is a very dominant one in the ancient world. We see it in later usages of diaspora as well. And I think that by the time we get to the 1st century BCE or 1st century CE, the Jews who know this Greek word know it within the context of these very dark passages. Now, my book makes a claim that might be a little controversial or at least lacks consensus among academics, and that is that we should read the Septuagint in light of Judean culture and not in light of Egyptian Jewish culture. And the reason why this is a little bit controversial is because the Septuagint, of course, it's a Greek text, and ancient sources that we have about its production all agree that it was produced in the vicinity of Alexandria. According to the letter of Aristeas, it was produced and commissioned by the court of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. And this is not a text that we can rely on in terms of the historical details, but in this version, and also in later rabbinic retellings, Ptolemy II Philadelphus collaborates with leaders of the Jerusalem temple to bring in scholars from the land of Israel, from Judea, into Egypt, and they produce the Septuagint. Now, again, we don't exactly know if the details provided in Aristeas are exactly accurate, but the question is, do you read this, this translation as reflective primarily of cultural milieu that's set in Egypt or in Judea? I read the Septuagint as more Judean for a number of reasons. There are all kinds of linguistic reasons why scholars do read the Septuagint as influenced by Judean culture. But also, when you line up the Septuagint, especially texts like Deuteronomy 28, when you line it up with other Judean texts that engage with questions about the concept of diaspora, you get a very cohesive picture. And that picture suggests that Jews in the land of Israel are very worried about the piety of their kin who live outside the land of Israel, and are making an argument over and over for Judean exceptionalism and Judean authority. Now, interestingly, the Jews in the land of Israel seem particularly obsessed with Egypt and the Jews in Egypt. And there are all kinds of reasons of why that might be. There are Jews living all over the Hellenistic world, but they seem really obsessed with Jews in Egypt. first of all, there's a massive population of Jews living in Egypt at this time. And second of all, there's a lot of interaction and migration in both directions. So Jews in the land of Israel are going to Egypt and vice versa. These communities know each other, they care about each other. I hesitate to make contemporary analogs, but it's not totally unlike the relationship between Jews in the United States or in New York, let's say, and Jews in Jerusalem today, even though we're very far from each other. It's just a plane ride away. And there's a lot of cultural engagement. There's a lot of alignment in values, and also a lot of misunderstanding.
So I can relate to your reservations about the terminology Second Temple Judaism as far as periodization is concerned. I shared that as well. The term Septuagint. So I learned a lot of things, interesting things reading your book. First, if I've understood correctly, the noun diaspora, which we have in Greek, appears for the first time, I guess, in the Septuagint. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so it's a neologism, a new word, or makes its first entrance into the writings that have survived history in the Septuagint itself. Just for our audience, Septuagint, ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. This wasn't done overnight. It started first with the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses, and then gradually other books that are now in the Hebrew Bible were translated into Greek. Now, the term diaspora doesn't appear very often. 12 times, you said, across all of these writings in the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek. And it seems like the outlook is negative. There's a negative view of living in a diaspora. And your thesis is because precisely the Septuagint reflects more of a Judean outlook than a diasporan outlook, that the translators of these texts, I guess they were from Judea, even as the letter of Aristeas itself admits. And so they're projecting, let's say, this Judeo-centric worldview. Life is better here in the land of Judea. You should be here. Diaspora is equated with exile, with the curses in Deuteronomy 28. I don't know if I've paraphrased somewhat correctly what you're claiming.
That was an excellent and succinct overview, much better than mine.
Oh, I'm not sure about that. But moving on,
Okay.
your book focuses especially on the relations between Judea and Egypt. They're just next door, and there's an abundance of records of correspondence between these two Judean Jewish communities. The earliest records, I believe, come from the island of Elephantine in Egypt, on an island on the Nile River. I think that most of our audience here will not be familiar with this place as it relates to Jewish history. So I was wondering if you could maybe share a bit about the Judeans from Elephantine, Egypt. When was this Jewish community founded? What do the letters that were discovered on this site tell us about diasporan Judean relations?
Yes, I'd love to talk about that. And we'll also note that these it's hard to translate Yehudim. These, we'll just say Judahites, I guess. There's a scholarly debate over when you start to say Judean and then Jew. But this community from the land of Israel they were not the first to arrive in Egypt. We know that even in the late first temple period, there are Jews fleeing the chaos as Babylonia is this growing behemoth, and their attack is becoming increasingly imminent. There are people fleeing to Egypt. We have some evidence or some text from the book of Jeremiah that addresses these communities and warns them against becoming assimilated. We have a variety of migration waves that are coming from the end of the First Temple era all the way into the early Second Temple era. But the community of Elephantine that is from the land of Israel, they seem to be affiliated with a Persian military garrison that arrives on the island in maybe as early as the late 6th century BCE. We found, not we, I wish it was me, but a cache of papyri in 1908 in the early 20th century that were very well preserved in this dry climate. And in this cache, there were many documents found, not only from these particular Judeans, but among this massive cache, we, again, scholars have found an archive of documents that includes day-to-day contractual records, including property sales, loans, betrothals, and these documents also reveal key information about how this community conducted their social activities and their ritual practices. So we have some really fascinating examples of such documents. We have a text that scholars refer to as the Passover letter, which required a lot of reconstruction, and that reconstruction is now considered to be rather controversial. But Bezalel Porton and other scholars read this quite damaged letter as referring to the question of how to observe the Passover holiday on the island. And they're reaching out to Judean authorities and asking for permission to observe the holiday in a particular way. My book focuses on a different letter, which is navigating the complex relationships with their Egyptian neighbors and with authorities in Jerusalem. So from a very early stage, these communities of Judahites, later Judeans, these communities from the land of Israel are doing this very delicate dance. They're navigating two relationships: the relationship with their host empire, their host community, and their ancestral land. And the letter that I focus on in the book is expresses a lot of anxiety about the vandalization of a temple that this community of Yehudim had built on the island. Apparently, according to the writers, this temple had been destroyed, or again, partly destroyed by Egyptian priests. And this letter petitions someone named Bagavachia, who's the governor of the Persian province known as Yehud. So this is the land of Israel. The Persians call this the province of Yehud. So the governor or a leader of Yehud named it Bagavachia. It's a question of whether maybe he's Judean, but probably he's Persian. But they're asking Bagavachia to for permission to rebuild their temple after it has been vandalized by Egyptian priests of Khnum. So what's fascinating is, first of all, we have two copies of this letter and they're not exactly the same. So it seems like a scribe revised certain aspects of the original letter to make the case a little more appealing. And perhaps most fascinatingly, we have a copy of the response that Bagavachia sends back to the community after consultation with local Yehudim. So the response that is sent back to the community expresses dissatisfaction, or at least a certain amount of displeasure with the very fact that there is a temple to the ancestral god of the Yehudim on Elephantine. Again, the question is, can we rebuild the temple? We need official Persian permission to do that. Again, this is already odd. Why are they sending this request to a Persian leader in Jerusalem, the governor of Yehud? They could have sent it to any number of Persian officials, but already it seems like maybe they're selecting Bagavachia because there's a certain sensitivity towards leaders in Jerusalem, and they want to make sure that they are not burning bridges, so to speak, with their kin in the land of Israel. They want to make sure that they have the green light not only from political authorities connected to Persia, but also members of their own religious community. The response does confirm that there's consultation, again, collaboration between Persian political authorities and local Yehudim, and it reads as follows. What Bagavachia and Delaya said to me. Delaya is a name that would have been either given to a Hebrew or an Aramaic speaking person. Delaya would probably be Hebrew. So it seems like we have this Persian Bagavachia who's talking to a local person from Yehud, and they agree to the following. and now I'm paraphrasing, you can rebuild the temple, you can rebuild it to its former measurements and dimensions. And on this temple, you can bring a meal offering and you can bring incense. The original request asks Bhagavacha for permission to bring a meal offering and incense and animal sacrifices. So it's very telling that the response leaves off animal sacrifices. And the implication is you cannot bring animal sacrifices on this temple. And the way that I read this response is that there's an undercurrent here of saying, lest you think that this is a real temple in the fashion of the Jerusalem temple, will disabuse you. It's almost like I wouldn't want to say a toy temple, but it's a inferior imitation of the real thing. You cannot sacrifice animals at this temple. Okay, you want to bring some flour? Good, take some flour, put it on an altar. You want to bring some incense? Okay, mix some spices together and do whatever you want to do with the incense on your altar. That's all adorable. But you think you're going to bring an ox? You think you're going to bring in a goat or a bird and sacrifice it? No, calm down. Now, there are two ways to read this. You could also read this by saying authorities in Jerusalem connected with the Persian government don't want these Yehudim to antagonize local Egyptians, right? Because clearly the Egyptians feel antagonized, and they don't worship goats. They don't sacrifice goats because some of these communities are worshiping goats. And so maybe you could read this as saying, don't antagonize your neighbors. We don't want to keep hearing about your fighting. But another way to read it, and I don't think that these are mutually exclusive, is to say, we're not going to support a full-fledged temple that risks replacing the dignity and integrity of the Jerusalem temple. And so there might be two reasons for why authorities in Jerusalem, both Judahite and Persian, are not really interested in fully restoring or fully supporting the restoration of this temple in Elephantine. But these letters do speak to the tensions that are sort of at the core of these various relationships and the ways in which this community at Elephantine has to navigate in a complex way these various relationships. They have to acknowledge the authority of leaders in Jerusalem, but they're also seeking a certain degree of independence. And this tension becomes increasingly explicit as we move into the Hellenistic era.
So many of our viewers, they'll be like, there was another Jewish temple. Did I hear that correctly? Apparently in Elephantine. And so you'll have to just read Dr. Simkovich's book to learn more about this correspondence. The letters are very early. I think it's 5th century BC, thereabouts, right? 400s. So we're really
some of the letters are. Sorry.
No, we're really overlapping with a period with the biblical texts here, and so it really gives us a fascinating window, not only into Jewish diasporan relations at this time, but just what was Jewish or Israelite practice like, and to discover that lo and behold there was a temple in Elephantine offering sacrifices. Now the question of why in the correspondence. The response from the headquarters, so to speak, in Jerusalem is only, flower offerings and incense, but no mention of burnt offerings, for example, of animals. Could that be sort of like contestation is going on there between diaspora and homeland already, and or they don't want to offend the Egyptians who had destroyed the temple, the Egyptian priests of Khnum. I think Khnum, I'm not very strong with my Egyptology here, but is that the god of the rams? Ram god?
It is. Correct.
So maybe there could be something going on there as well at the same time. I don't think it has to be an either or. Both reasons can be complementary, taken into consideration. And in fact, well, yeah, our audience will just have to look at the book, read your book, because they'll discover there was yet another temple later on in Egypt, the temple at Leontopolis that, well, spoiler alert, they'll have to read about. Because of time, I think there's just so much literature that you cover very nicely in your book. What I suggest is we talk a little bit about the book of Esther, which you do cover, you emphasize that there were a variety of views during the Second Temple period, so-called, about the meaning of life in the diaspora. So in the book of Esther, and I'm talking here about the Hebrew version that we find in the Tanakh, there's one worldview there or outlook that you posit for that book. So let's maybe start with the Hebrew book of Esther. How does this Hebrew book view Jewish life abroad?
I love this question because the answer is we really don't know. You could read Hebrew Esther in two diametrically opposed and completely legitimate ways. You could read Esther as a book that reminds all Jews, wherever they live, that God always protects the Jewish people, and therefore you can live wherever you want and have a guarantee of God's unconditional protection, even when things seem completely existentially dangerous and the future seems so grim. You could also read Esther as saying the exact opposite, which is that life in the diaspora is incredibly dangerous, and that Jews face unique dangers when they are vulnerable to a foreign government that could, at the slightest whim, turn on the Jews. And even when things seem great on Wednesday, on Thursday, they're out to get you. And therefore, Jews do not belong in the diaspora. And so I think that you could really defend both readings from the Hebrew version. And that ambiguity is what makes Esther so rife for interpretation, because Jews want to clarify ambiguity. We all have this impulse when you read a text and there's something unclear, you have an impulse to provide clarity. That's why we have so much interpretation on the most difficult books of the Bible. And we find in the Hellenistic era that Jews in the land of Israel want to make certain clarifications about the meaning of Esther. And they seem to have been worried that Jews in other lands would problematically interpret Esther in ways that legitimize their diasporic circumstances. Of course, we all know the problems with Esther. It's lacking in religious content. There's no reference to God. There's no reference to ancestral laws. And the biggest problem of all, which I think doesn't get a lot of face time, is that it ends happily in the intermarriage between King Ahasuerus, and Esther. Nobody talks about that problem. That to me seems like the biggest problem. They walk off into the sunset, and the author seems to think that this is great. She presumably lives the rest of her life in the court of the king as his wife, as wife number one. And so there is a lot of concern, naturally, with the question of how to properly interpret this book. And so a new version of Esther is produced. In fact, there might have been more than one version of Esther produced in Greek that addresses these questions. This version that we just call Greek Esther, and again, there is actually more than one Greek Esther, but the Greek Esther that we find in the Septuagint is often misread as a diasporan work that represents Hellenized Jewry. One of the things that I try to drive home in the book is that Greek Esther is actually a Judean text. And we know this because it closes with a colophon, with a signatorial line that places the production of this text in Jerusalem. Now, this Greek text, in many ways, is much more pious than the Hebrew version because it solves all the problems. God is everywhere. There's lots of reference to ancestral laws of the Jews. Mordecai and Esther utter very pious prayers to God in their states of crisis right before Esther approaches the king and asks for him to join the party and names Haman as the enemy. I'm assuming that most of you out there have read the book and are familiar with the story. But very oddly, the Hebrew version seems to be far more problematic than the Greek version, which kind of solves all the problems, or at least tries to, by inserting all this religious content. Interestingly, it's also that this version that includes a lot of Hellenistic stylistics, which you might think is strange, being that I just said it's a Judean text, except if you read it as a Judean text meant for an Egyptian Jewish audience, it makes a lot of sense. Because, and this is the way I read it at least, the people who produced Greek Esther in Jerusalem are asking themselves, what will most appeal to a Jewish audience living in Egypt that can also convey the extraordinary dangers of diaspora, so that the people who read this properly understand what this book is about. So we're going to put in all the religious content. We're going to make sure that they understand this is a religious book. We'll add some Hellenistic stylistics to keep them entertained, some dreams that include some dragons, all kinds of incredible soliloquies and speeches, all the things that you would have seen on a Greek play. But we're also going to be very clear that this book is about danger and the Jews' vulnerability when they live outside the land of Israel.
I understood you correctly, the Hebrew version of the Tanakh, which most people are probably going to be familiar with, it's open to interpretation. But one way you could interpret this text, as far as diaspora is concerned, is that diaspora is accepted, is welcomed, embraced in that text. True, under exceptional circumstances, it can be dangerous to be a Jew in the diaspora. But otherwise, both Mordecai and Esther, the two main Jewish protagonists in this book, they make it, and they make it way up into the echelons of Persian society. Then we have this Greek Esther. So we could say this is part of the Septuagint, a growing corpus of translations of Hebrew texts into Greek. And in addition to translating Hebrew Esther into Greek, it has additional stories that are added into this text, the so-called additions, Greek additions to Esther, which are very fascinating. And there it seems like life in diaspora is looked upon with greater suspicion, is what you're saying. And the explanation is actually, although this book is written in Greek, its provenance, it originates from Judea. It was written by somebody in Judea for a diasporan audience. Is that correct?
Yes, and you find this negative attitude towards the diaspora, especially predominant in the prayers of Mordecai and Esther, when they reach out into the distant history of the people and they reference the past dangers that Jews experienced, that Israelites experienced, and how God saved them. So the way that Esther references past crises, it's not limited to things that take place outside the land of Israel, but it highlights those dangers. And so, yes, there's an indication. Dangerous things can happen wherever you live, but especially in the diaspora, the people of Israel are extraordinarily vulnerable and always dependent on God. And so even this message, you can imagine how a Judean in Jerusalem would want to remind their kin living in Egypt of this. Don't get too comfortable. Don't think that your success is just attributed to your own wit and hard work. God is always in control, and you could lose everything in an instant. And so turn to us for guidance, turn to us for authority, for spiritual direction, and don't get lost thinking that you're safe out there in the diaspora.
Point out in passing rabbinic interpretations of the book of Esther. Could you share a few words about that?
Yes, I think that the Judean attitude that Esther highlights, how diaspora is a dangerous place, I think that that becomes the dominant approach in later rabbinic writings as well. Midrashic traditions about Esther highlight the way in which Esther is an observant, pious Jew. I remember learning as a kid that Esther had 7 maids. I don't know if you know this tradition. She had 7 maids, and then she called each maid a day of the week. And then every day of the week, she relied on a different maid so that she would know when the Sabbath was. So when it was time for maid number 7, maid Shabbat, the maid Sabbath would come and would minister to Esther, and then she would know today is the day of Sabbath. There are other Midrashic traditions about Esther observing the dietary laws. Of course, none of these things are in the Hebrew version, but rabbinic writers certainly share the anxiety that earlier Judean writers have, which is that they don't want readers to misinterpret this book as one that guarantees a Jew's safety wherever they live and regardless of what they do.
So this is interesting. There's an overlap maybe in the reservations about diaspora, but also this expansionist maybe tendency that we see with Greek Esther, with the additions. In the Talmud, there's a whole tractate Megillah, dealing with the story of Purim, retellings of the story of Esther, where they're adding, they're paraphrasing, and then we have Targums, Aramaic translations of Esther that continue that tendency as well. In the conclusion of your book, you compare and contrast these many Jewish views from the Second Temple period about diaspora with rabbinic views on the same topic that developed in the centuries after the Second Temple period. So we'll say after 70, thereabouts. Generally speaking, what are some of the novel features that emerge after 70 in rabbinic discourses about life outside the Jewish homeland?
Yeah, this is a massive question, and there should be a book written about this at some point. I don't know if I'm going to be the one to write it, but the question of how the rabbis view the diaspora. First of all, when we talk about rabbinic literature, I think it's more useful to talk about the word galut. That's the word that the rabbis use. And galut is not exactly the same thing as diaspora, as the Greek term that was used but was so rare in the Hellenistic era that that preceded the rabbis. Galut is a little different, and it's different in a number of key ways. When I talk about diaspora, I'm talking about a particular space. And by the way, both of these terms are different from the word used in the Hebrew Bible, which is golah, because golah, which we find in Ezekiel, and we find it in other late biblical texts, golah is the place to which the Judahites were brought, which is Bavel, right? They're brought to Babylonia. So it's not everywhere outside the land of Israel. But diaspora is. In other words, if you're outside the land of Israel, you're in diaspora. That said, it's a space, right? So if you're either in the land of Israel or you're in the diaspora, you're in the dispersion. Now that could be Babylonia, it could be Antioch, right? Could be Cyprus, could be Rome, could be Egypt, could be anywhere. But it's a spatial category. And if you're in the diaspora, according to some Jews, you were living in a state of divine rejection because God didn't want you there. God wanted you to come back. You had the choice to come back and you made the choice not to. So therefore you were out of favor with God. The rabbis add, or they highlight, temporal dimensions to this idea in the framework of galut. So galut is not merely a place. Galut is an internalized spiritual state, which means that we are now in an era of galut. It doesn't negate the spatial aspects, right? Because when Rome invades in 70 CE, it's only 65 years before the Jews are expelled from Jerusalem following the disaster of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And so there is this sense that the Jews can't go back. They can't be in Jerusalem. So there is a kind of a feeling of this spatial exile, I guess you would say in English, which I don't like that word because it's confusing. Am I talking about diaspora or galut? But the rabbis are much more interested in galut as an era. So all Jews are now in an era of galut, right? And there are different galuyot. There are different periods of exile. Now they're in this Roman era, and it will only be resolved when the Messiah comes and ushers in the Messianic age, and then all Jews will no longer be in an era, in this internalized state of galut. So again, I don't think it negates the spatial aspect, but there is this very key temporal aspect to galut, that we are in galut as an existential status. Now, one of the things that the rabbis do to offer comfort to their own community is to argue that just because we're all in a state of galut does not mean that we are estranged from God temporally and spatially, but God too is in a state of suffering in the wake of the catastrophes that have taken place in 70 and later. There was a terrible Jewish rebellion against the Roman Empire that took place outside the land of Israel in 115 to 118 CE. Many people don't know about this war. Then, of course, there's Bar Kokhba. So there are all kinds of terrible clashes that are taking place in the late 1st and 2nd centuries. And the rabbis who are writing in the wake of these events are imagining God suffering with the people. And very famously, there's a tradition that appears in numerous midrashic collections in which God is going into each of these exiles. Again, it's a physical place and it's a spiritual time, it's all of it, but God is going into exile with the Jewish people, or with the people of Israel. And so this idea that God is suffering alongside the people in their states of spiritual estrangement, it's contradictory, right? Because, like, if God is with us, what are we estranged from? But it's also a very sophisticated idea, because we're awaiting this kind of resolution. We're both in states of intimacy and in states of separation. It can only be resolved when we have a temple, when we are serving God in the way that we are meant to, when we have some kind of independent hegemony, when things are back into the normal order, the natural state of things. But right now, there's kind of an unnaturalness to living in galut. And so the rabbis, in a very sophisticated way, explore these themes. I would also hesitate to say too much that synchronizes or that harmonizes the rabbis, because you have so many statements in the Talmud, as you know, that delegitimize life outside the land of Israel. But then you have just as many that argue for the greatness of the rabbinic community in Babylonia. And so to sort of mush it all together in one pot and try to argue for any kind of homogenous attitude, I think, is a mistake. This is a multi-vocal tradition, and there are many rabbis coming from different cultures and with different attitudes towards these questions. But in a very broad sense, you see the theme that galut is an era, is also a spiritual state of being, but nevertheless, the idea that God is suffering with us can offer some kind of limited resolution to the estrangement that we're experiencing.
Would you translate galut as exile? I mean, I've never thought of how to properly translate that term. I've just taken it for granted. Galut is exile.
The problem that I see with that is that I think English speakers think of exile in very tangible, corporeal terms. If I'm wrong, if English speakers think of exile more in a more abstract sense, then I think it's fine. But my concern is that it is thought of as a physical place, and that it loses some of those nuances that we find in the Hebrew.
That's fascinating. Well, Dr. Simkovich, thanks so much for sharing your expertise and time with Talmud for Everyone. Before you leave, and this is maybe an unfair question, but we usually ask our interviewees, our guests, what are your future projects? I mean, your book is not even out, and we're already asking you, what are you working on next? But maybe there's some projects that you have on the table that you'd like to share with our audience.
Thank you. No, it's a fun question. I I've been working on a number of things pertaining to contemporary Judaism at the moment. Part of this is just in response to the events of October 7th. It's increasingly challenging for me to um, work in the world of Second Temple Judaism. As much as I love those texts and I love thinking about the Jews who wrote these texts, there's so many urgent issues in the world right now, and that's what's pulling me in. I'm writing an article on Christian responses to October 7th. Also writing a different article on Jewish poetic responses to catastrophe in general. And on the side, I'm working on a book on modern Orthodox Judaism. So I'm I have a lot of things in the pipeline when it comes to contemporary Jewish life, but I will always hold a special place in my heart for Second Temple Judaism.
Wow. And this book that came out, that's coming out rather in June, is very much apropos of what's going on here when we're thinking about diaspora, about Judea. It's been Dr. Malka Simkovich who spoke about her new book, Jewish Letters from Home, The Creation of Diaspora in Jewish Antiquity. It's available for pre-order, and we'll have it available in the link below this video. Thank you again, Dr. Simkovich, for sharing your time with us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.